Whispers from Below, a horror podcast by Justin W. Geis. Scary stories, both real and fake. Hello, listeners. Welcome to Season 2, Episode 6 of Whispers from Below, a podcast by a madman for madmen. I'm your resident psychopath, Justin W. Geis, and today's topic of discussion is John Wayne Gacy. I know that I talked about him in last week's episode, and then I was like, oh, I want to make a future episode about him, so I'm not gonna, talk too much about him or whatever. And then I started talking about him and I was like, oh, I'm excited about this topic and I want to go into more detail. So I just decided to do it this week. We're getting 2 weeks of clowns in a row. So for those of you that don't like clowns, sorry. And for those of you that love clowns, congratulations. You get 2 weeks of clown content. I obviously focus way more on him as a person than his clown persona because that's more important to the episode. But this is definitely a much darker episode than last week. This is a pretty scary topic. Serial killers are always going to be darker, especially with the messed up stuff that they did. I would say that for a younger listener, maybe the first part of this is okay, but there's a lot of child abuse. There's a lot of sexual assault. There's just a lot in this episode that I think would not necessarily be great for a younger listener. You can start listening to it, and if you feel uncomfortable, please, turn it off. This week's episode might not be for you. I'll try to do one that's lighter next week. That's always what I try to do, is a little bit of this week was really dark, and I don't know if you're going to like it, but, next week might be a lighter topic, still in sort of a spooky vein. So just, keep your eyes open, keep your ears open for an episode that might interest you, because this one might not be it. Yeah, that's pretty much it. So without further ado, let's get into the episode. So, John Wayne Gacy was born March 17th, 1942 in Chicago, Illinois. He was born as the second child and only son of John Stanley Gacy and his mother. John Stanley Gacy, I focus more on him than the mom, because the mom is a pretty chill, normal mom. But his dad was a World War I veteran, and opened up an auto repair machinist place. He was a pretty overweight kid, and he was not really athletic, back to Gacy himself. And he was really close to his two sisters and his mother, but he was not very close to his dad for very obvious reasons. His father was a big alcoholic, and would often come home after drinking, or would be drinking at home, and would beat his kids and his wife basically almost to death. Gacy later recounts that he was, quote, never enough, unquote, in his father's eyes. That was in an interview with him. He was I always was seeking my father's attention and his respect, and I could never, ever, ever get it. And that's part of the reason why he's so messed up. He just keeps seeking this gratification from his father, and it never gets there. His father would frequently belittle him, calling him a sissy, saying that he would probably grow up to be a queer, that he was never going to amount to anything, because this was back in the day when it's still not widely accepted, but it's way more accepted now than it was back then, that growing up to be a queer person, or a gay person, or however you want to identify, was seen as a misstep for people. It was I can't believe that you chose this path, and blah blah blah. I don't want to get into all that because it's a heated topic. It's very personal to me, obviously. But so keep that in mind. That's a really big part of his childhood, is don't be gay. So that kind of creates conflict, as you can imagine. Gacy would later recount that one of his earliest memories was being beaten with a leather belt when he was 4 years old. So if that gives you any indication, about his life. He was mostly beaten with like leather belts and stuff. But there was one time when he got rendered unconscious when he got hit in the head with a broom when he was like 5 or 6. When he was 7, he got caught fondling a young girl with another boy in the neighborhood or like another classmate. They were like messing around with a younger girl, and it was like a really bad thing. So he got like the shit kicked out of him by his dad, obviously. And then later that year, he got molested by a family friend. He would like take him in his car and like touch him and stuff. But he didn't really know what was going on because he's so young, number one. And number two, he felt like he couldn't tell anyone, number one, because it was a family friend. And number two, because he talks about how, like, you know, I didn't think that anyone would believe me. And even if they did, they would blame me for what happened. Like, I would get in trouble for him doing something to me, and I didn't want to deal with it. Um, he ended up developing like a pretty bad heart condition when he was like 7-ish. And he couldn't participate in sports in school. So he had to like sit out of gym class and stuff, which probably added to his like overweight nature because he couldn't really exercise too much. And in 4th grade, he started having really bad blackouts, and he was frequently hospitalized for the condition. Sometimes he would seizure, sometimes he would just like black out and forget what was going on. His father would openly tell people that it was fake, and he like didn't believe that it was a real illness, and he was just trying to get out of school or whatever. Um, there were a couple of people though that never doubted, like his family and like a friend was kind of like, I never doubt that you're, not sick, but this condition was never like conclusively diagnosed. Like no one really knows um what it was. And it could have also been like a psychosomatic thing of like he wasn't getting any attention and he felt like nobody loved him, so he like built up this disease so that people would pay attention and care about him. It could have been something like that, which is very probable, especially given his diagnosis like later in life. um, but nobody's really sure what it was at the time. Also, when I keep saying like, oh, like he later recounted, he later talked, I get into it a little bit later in the episode, but Gacy was like very much aware of what he was doing and why it was wrong. And he like he like confessed to all of it, like right off the bat. Like the minute there was like any sort of suspicion around him, he basically broke down and was like, yeah, I did it. Here's where all the bodies are. Like, and we'll get into it a little bit later, but like he really talked a lot. He really gave a lot of detail about what had happened. Um so we'll get into that a little bit later, but when I say like he later recounted, like that was in interviews when he was in prison or like with a psychiatrist or whatever, like after the fact. Something that's interesting to note that I was reading is that it was reported that Gacy never struck his father back, like his family members, and there was a friend of his that came over one day and watched him get beat up. Um, they said that like his father would hit him and he would just lift his hands up to protect himself. He never hit his father back. Not once is there any account from family or friends that Gacy ever hit his father back, even though like by the time he was like, 17 or 18, it's even younger than that, 14, 15, it's very probable to hit your father back. Like if he's beating the crap out of you, like there are a lot of cases of kids like killing, an abusive parent because they like get fed up with it and they finally strike back. Like it happens, but there's no reports of him ever doing that. So he had a lot of bottled up anger, emotions, feelings. At age 18, he became involved in politics, specifically with the Democratic Party, and he worked as an assistant precinct captain for for a Democratic candidate. His father obviously hated that. I wrote, "Father hated that." Duh. And called him a patsy, and again was like, "You're gonna grow up to be a queer with those Democrats and whatever." Gacy ended up getting a car that his father basically controlled. Like he wouldn't give him the keys unless he had done things that his father had deemed like were acceptable. If he ever messed up in his father's eyes, his father would take away the car. After one incident where he ended up like removing the fuel cap on the car and holding it for like 3 days so that Gacy couldn't go anywhere with the car. After he got it back, he took the car and he drove all the way to Las Vegas, like basically ran away from home. He started working with an ambulance service before he ended up transferring over to the mortuary. He slept behind the embalming room, and he worked for them for about 3 months. And again, like he slept in there, he was around dead bodies all the time. And you start to see that we'll get into it. There was one night he climbed into the coffin of a young teenage boy that had recently deceased, and he like cuddled with the body and like caressed it. He was working alone, so nobody was there. And then it freaked him out, and he like snapped out of whatever like sort of trance he was in, and he was like, holy shit, I need to go home. So you start to see his like weird uh necrophilic is the wrong word because that's not really what he was into, but his sort of like, any way I can get close to a boy, I'm gonna do it. Like his pedophilic nature sort of comes out. So he ends up calling his mom, and asking if he's allowed to come home. And the mom obviously has to check with the father, and the father's like, yeah, what the fuck ever. So he ends up coming home. He never ended up graduating high school, because he left to like move to Las Vegas and stuff. He ends up graduating later while he's in prison. I think while he's in prison the first time, he takes high school classes and gets his high school degree. But regardless of him not graduating high school at this point, he ends up enrolling in Northwestern Business College successfully, and he graduates in 1963. He worked through the ranks of the Nunbush Shoe Company, becoming manager of the sales department. And during all of this, he ended up joining the Jaycees, which is like it's like a political group kind of, that was just focused on like job development and improving the lives of other people. He like worked his way up through the ranks like really, really far. I think he became like vice president at one point. And I didn't write down a lot about it because it's kind of a side note of his life. Like it's important in the sense of like it comes into play later politically, but like honestly, it didn't have that much bearing on his life. It was just kind of like another thing that added to people thinking he was a great person before everything went down. In March 1964, he became engaged to Marlon Myers, which was a co-worker at the shoe place. And they ended up getting married in September of 1964. His wife's father ended up purchasing 3 KFCs in Waterloo, Iowa, and he made an offer to Gacy that if they moved there, Gacy would be able to manage the 3 restaurants and earn a lot of money. So they decided to move back into their parents' home, which the parents had vacated so that they could stay there. And he ended up managing the 3 KFCs that were in Waterloo. He ended up creating like a construction company called PDM, while he was also doing the KFC stuff. And any of his employees that were male, he would like ask them for sex. And if they denied, he would sort of say that it was like a test for science or it was like a test of their faith. But like if they said yes, he would kind of like flirt with them. Like he was constantly asking like his younger male employees for sex. I 100% lied to you. PDM does not get started until way later. This was just at the KFC. I lied to you. He starts PDM after he goes to prison. I'm sorry. I had my facts in the wrong order. I was looking at the wrong page in my notes. I'm human. Forgive me. So anyway, continuing on. So he ends up having a son and a daughter in February of 1966 and March 1967, respectively. And he ends up finally getting approval from his father. This is really important, is that once he gets married, has kids, is a manager, he ends up getting approval. His father says, quote, "Son, I was wrong about you," unquote. Which, like, honestly, given what his father had done to him, that's, like, pretty much the best thing that he could have asked for. He ends up becoming a huge part of the Jaycees, as I mentioned earlier, and he joins the Waterloo chapter of the sort of like culty situation. The Waterloo chapter was very much into like wife swapping and pornography, prostitution, drug use, stuff like that. And he was like, yeah, I'm down for that. So he ended up sleeping with a bunch of different prostitutes, and kind of like swapping his wife around and stuff. He ended up assaulting a young teenage boy in August of 1967. The 15-year-old named Donald Voorhees was lured with the promise of like porn, and then Gacy got him drunk and convinced him to perform oral sex upon him or like give him a blowjob. He basically like convinced him to like suck his dick. I don't really mince words, so sorry if what I'm saying is like not the politically correct way to say it, but that's how I speak. So that's what you get. In the following months, he ended up sexually abusing a bunch of other teenagers in a very similar way. But in one case, he ended up convincing the young boy to have sex with his wife before he blackmailed him into like having sex with Gacy. Um, in March of 1968, Voorhees ended up telling his father about what had happened, and his father immediately went to the police. Gacy kept denying the accusation and the charges of oral sodomy. He kept saying, I didn't do it, I didn't do it, I didn't do it. This boy's lying. He said, I demand a polygraph test. They did the polygraph test, and every time they brought up, Voorhees or any of the other people that were, pressing charges, he would get really nervous. So, like, he failed the polygraph test because he did it, but he kept saying he didn't. He insisted that the charges were all politically motivated because Voorhees Sr. had really wanted the president's status of the JCs in Iowa, but that is the status that Gacy had. So that's the only real point when the JC kind of like comes up is he's like, it was politically motivated and blah, blah, blah. August 30th, 1968, Gacy ends up paying an 18-year-old boy to beat the crap out of the young Voorhees in an effort to deter him from testifying. He pays this boy to like put on a mask, spray mason this kid's eye, and like beat the shit out of him. Voorhees escapes and immediately goes to the police and reports it. He says, this is the kid that did it. I know his name. I know his face. They end up arresting the kid, and he throws Gacy under the bus like pretty much immediately, which adds charges to Gacy's sentence. He gets observed by psychiatrists who identified that he has antisocial personality disorder, along with like a little bit of like how do I word it? He's a little bit of a sociopath and a little bit of a psychopath, like just a touch. That goes along with his like antisocial stuff. But his mental status was like he knew that what he did was wrong, so he's competent to stand trial, which was the big thing. They were like, we don't really care about the other stuff. We just want to make sure that like he knows what he did was wrong so that he can stand trial, which they decided he was. November 7th, 1968, he pled guilty to one count of sodomy on Voorhees, but not guilty to any of the other youths that had pressed charges. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but he only served 18 months of this sentence due to good behavior, which I think is wild that he only served 18 months of a 10-year sentence. That's basically like a year and a half. He only served, basically, I'm an idiot. That is a year and a half. He only served a year and a half of a 10-year sentence because he was nice. Like, I just think that that's ridiculous. Probably also had something to do with the fact that he was like a white man who was like upper middle class. Like I'm sure there were a lot of things that went into that with him managing to get out. But whoa, that's just crazy to me that that's allowed. On the same day that he got sentenced, his wife divorced him, took the kids and said, you will be paying alimony and blah, 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 blah. But you won't see them again. And he never saw them again. Not the wife, not the kids, nothing. Christmas Day, 1969, while he was still in prison, his father ended up dying, and reports say that he collapsed to the floor crying and asked if he could take, viewed, what is it? It's like leave, basically, like, can I take a vacation and, like, go to his funeral, but, like, I have armed guards watching me 24/7 so that I can't, like, escape, and they denied it, but he did request that. He ended up getting parole with 12 months probation on June 18th, 1970. And one of the conditions was that he had to relocate to Chicago and live with his mother. And the other condition was that he had to deal with a 10 p.m. curfew. Um, he said sure, obviously. On February 12th, 1971, he got charged with sexual assault of a teenage boy. Yet again, can't keep it in his pants, apparently. But this got dismissed when the boy wasn't in court. And what's interesting to note is that this would have broken his probation, his parole, and he would have gotten sent back to prison. But because he was in Chicago, he was in a different state, and word never got back to Iowa, where he had been in prison. It never got back to the parole office in Iowa that he had broken his parole. So he was like free to go. So he ends up buying a house. This is the house where all of his known murders were committed. For those of you that are interested, it's 8213 West Somerdale Avenue. I don't know if the house still exists or if they tore it down. A lot of times, for those of you that don't know, if a serial killer commits a lot of crimes in a house or an apartment building or something, a lot of times they will like vacate that apartment, like you're not allowed to stay in that apartment anymore. Or they'll tear down the house because the neighborhood wants it torn down. It's like it leaves like such a bad taste in people's mouths. It happens a lot, especially when like the bodies were in the house, which they were in this case. So I didn't do any research into the house. I don't know if it's still there. I don't know if someone's living in it currently. If they are, whoa, that's a lot to deal with. But it might have been torn down. But for those of you that were interested, that's the address. Maybe you live around there if you live in Chicago. I don't know. But I just thought it was fun to throw that in there. 8213 West Somerdale Avenue. His neighbors all said that he was, extremely friendly, extremely helpful. There are a bunch of cases of him, loaning power tools to people. He would plow snow out of people's driveways and stuff for free. Like he just would do it because he was a nice guy. And then he ended up getting engaged to Carol Hoff, who was a divorcee with 2 kids. He's got a type. And he had dated her very briefly in high school, so they kind of knew each other a little before they started dating again. And after just like a 6-month period of them dating again, they got married on July 1st, 1972. And then he got yet another. This is when I just started, like, the amount of charges that I kept pulling up, I stopped pulling up super long, like, spans of information on them because I was like, it's basically the same thing again. He got another charge of like sexually assaulting a youth, but then the kid like blackmailed him, and so the charges got dropped because they were like, this is all motivated by something that's not what actually happened, so we can't believe you anymore. It happens a lot when people are like, well, I'm gonna ruin you, and like, I'm gonna set this whole thing up so that you have to give me personal things that aren't it, and then all of a sudden the charge gets dropped because it's like, this is more of a motivation than just justice. He then started the construction business. Here we are. Now we're at that part. I was on the wrong page. I'm an idiot. Which is called PDM Contractors, which I think was for like painting, demolition, and maintenance or something like that. It was basically like an easy job that he could get as like a sex offender, pretty much, I think is what the purpose of that was. Most of his employees were high schoolers and young men that he often tried to get like sexual favors from. He would talk to the boys and be like, yeah, like, what if we did this? Like, it's for a science experiment. Like, it's, I'm doing scientific research and blah, 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 on homosexuality, whatever. In 1973, Gacy ended up raping a young boy in a hotel room when they were visiting Florida to visit a property that he was working on. The boy, once they got back to Chicago, ended up coming to his house and beating the shit out of him in his own yard, which I love that. He said, I'm going to take control. You go to the cops and say that I beat the shit out of you. I go to the cops and say that you raped me. We both have something on each other, but I just need to get it out. So he beats the crap out of him in the yard. The wife is like, what just happened? And Gacy claimed that it was because he refused to pay him. He refused. Wow. He refused to pay him due to like poor work quality. And so the guy was upset. And his wife was like, oh, that's so terrible. There were a bunch of, I wrote multiple almost rapes. There were a bunch of times where he like almost raped people. Like there was one case where he like had handcuffs on the kid and then he left the room for a second and the kid got the handcuffs off and then handcuffed him and started beating him. And like, there's a bunch of cases where like he kept trying to like sexually assault employees of his that just never got to the police. Um, he ends up getting divorced in 1975 because he told his wife that he was bisexual. And she was like, I think I can handle that. But then he would start to like leave all the time. He'd be gone like really late at night. He would come back with like young boys. They'd be in the garage for a while. And she was like, I feel so uncomfortable. Like these kids are underage. Like there's just so much happening. So she ends up leaving him. But mutually they agree that she needs to stay in the house for a little bit until she sort of gets on her feet, and then she leaves. That year is when he started to don his famous persona, which is Pogo the Clown. Pogo the Clown is his favorite like clown persona. He would show up at bars like that under the guise of like, I had just performed at like a kid's birthday, or like I was just at the hospital. But like a lot of people just think that he enjoyed being Pogo, and so he would just put on the makeup and the costume and like go around. He would perform a lot at like the children's hospitals or at birthday parties. He would even like on like ribbons, cutting the ribbon ceremonies and stuff for his construction business. He would show up as Pogo the Clown. Because of this, when word of what he had done got in the news, they ended up coining the name for him, the Killer Clown. That sort of became his like claim to fame. And then I wrote murders, finally. So that's all just background. For those of you that don't know, I take notes by hand for the podcast in a little notebook that I have. And this notebook is for sure a little bit smaller than my other one that I was using. But I had like 4.5 pages of notes on just the background. It's really nice when you do research on a serial killer or somebody that was bad and their childhood was like, it was a normal childhood, they're just bad. And you're like, oh, cool, because then you can skip all the background and go straight to the nitty-gritty stuff. But I think that all of this was so important to, like, his psychosis and, like, how he ended up doing what he did, that I think it's important to note before we get into it. But now we're finally in the murders. He ended up murdering at least 33 young men, 26 of whom were buried in a crawl space in his house. And he would have his construction workers that he would then murder basically dig their own graves in the crawl space under the guise of like, it's for piping, it's for stuff under the house. They would dig like, I think it was like 6 foot long, 2 foot wide, 2 foot deep trenches in the crawl space, like shallow graves, obviously, but like under the guise of like, it's for piping in the house. And then I just wrote down his modus operandi because there are a lot of names, there's a lot of specific cases and whatever. But what he used to do with pretty much everybody is he would lure the boys to his home under the promise of a job offer, under the offer of sex if they were openly homosexual, with drinks or drugs or something like that. He would get the victim drunk, or he would get them to trust him in some sort of way, be very friendly, open, the way he always was. He would then do what he called the handcuff trick, which is where he would put the handcuffs on himself and then he would magically get them off with a key that he had hidden between his fingers. And then he'd say, let me teach you how to do the trick, so put the handcuffs on. And then they would put the handcuffs on, and then he would say, the trick is you need the key. He would then rape and torture the victim. Oftentimes he would burn them with cigarettes. He would shove pill bottles and dildos and other things up their butt after he had already fucked them and raped them and stuff like that. There were a lot of cases where he would then make them crawl to the bathroom, or he would drag them there and he would repeatedly partially drown them and then revive them so that he can continue what he was doing. There were also a lot of cases where he would make them pretend to be a horse and he would ride on their back. And he would put like makeshift reins, like a rope or something around their neck and tug while they were like pretending to be a horse, which I thought that was weird. So like I double checked that and like a bunch of sites were like, yeah, that's something that he did because he liked horses. It's like, geez, that's intense. He would then murder them by using a garrote wire. And he would state he would always tell them, this is the last trick. This is the last trick. And he called it his rope trick, where he would strangle them. He would then normally let the body stay in his bed for about 24 hours-ish. Sometimes more, sometimes less, depending on the person, the body, whatever, before he would bury it under the house or throw it in a nearby river. Sometimes he would even take them to the garage and embalm the body before. He would then have him or his workers spread lime and stuff underneath the house because it helps with the decomposition of the bodies. So, that's really fun. His last murder before he got caught was of a boy named Robert Piest, Piest. I don't know how to say it. Apologies to the deceased, which sparked this sort of investigation. They ended up questioning Gacy because they had received word that he was the last person to speak to Robert at a gas station before he had disappeared. Gacy denied. He was like, I didn't even give him a job offer. I basically was just like, stop by PDM if you ever want, to have a job, but it's not really an offer. Like, you don't need to come with me. But everybody else was saying that he had said, come with me right now, which he did. They eventually received a search warrant because they were like, Gacy probably has him in his home. When they went through his house, they obviously found all of his torture devices. So they found an 18-inch dildo, which, holy crap, that as someone that is a gay man that has had sex, spoiler alert, that sounds so painful. That sounds so immensely uncomfortable and painful. Like, I cannot even imagine not only being tortured, but then to have that, like, that pain must have been unreal. A board with holes drilled in each end, along with ropes attached to it, where he would often tie their feet so that they couldn't run away. A hypodermic needle found in the bathroom, a bunch of boys' clothing that was definitely too small for him, like children's underwear and stuff like that, and a set of handcuffs with the keys. He then became under like constant surveillance for I think only like a couple days before he like cracked. But on December 20th, 1978, he felt so much guilt for what he had done that after drinking, he went to his lawyer's office for a meeting and ended up saying, Robert Piest is dead. He's in the river. This is where everybody else is. And he started admitting to all these murders. He was so drunk and sloshed that he ended up passing out and waking up the next day and denying that he ever said this. The lawyer had gotten him an appointment with a psychiatrist. And he was like, no, I don't need to do that. Everything's fine. Like, I don't know what I said. I'm probably just being dramatic. Like, it's not a thing. Like, it's not a thing. Don't worry about it. It's not a big deal, blah, blah, blah. Like, please don't tell anybody. I need to go say my goodbyes. So he didn't go see the psychiatrist, and he ends up leaving to go, like, basically say his goodbyes. He very drunkenly says goodbyes to people, tells people that this is the end. They're going to find out what he did, stuff like that. He ends up getting arrested and obviously convicted. They have a confession from him, and he immediately is like, yes, these are all the people that went missing. These are all the people I murdered. He helps them find all the boys, all the bodies in the crawl space, in the river, stuff like that. And he ends up getting sentenced to lethal injection on May 9th, 1994. 6 of his victims remain unidentified. They're not really sure who they are. He's not really sure who they are. And his last meal on death row, for those of you that are interested, and for those of you that don't know, when you're on death row, I don't know if they still do it because a lot of states don't have the death penalty now. But you used to get like a last meal. Like, what do you want as your last meal? It can be anything in the world, anything that you want to be the last thing that you eat before you die. And he wanted 12 fried shrimp, a bucket of original KFC recipe chicken, French fries, and a pound of strawberries. And then I wrote, no legal stuff for me, thanks. If you are listening to this episode for the first time and you don't really know, I don't tend to talk about the legal jargon and the legal stuff that happens in these cases, because I think once you know what they did, the legal stuff, unless it's very interesting, like when I end up doing an episode on Ted Bundy, that stuff is really important because it kind of shaped how the public viewed him. As far as Gacy goes, it's not very important because he admitted to everything right away. So the legal stuff was like, well, how soon is he going to die? Like, that's basically what it was. Like, how soon are we going to kill this dude? Um, but what's really interesting about Gacy is that everybody regarded him. It was one of the first times where you see a killer where everybody has sort of seen him as this lovely, beautiful person that was so helpful, and there was no way he could have done this, and he had this whole business, and like maybe he was gay, but like he wasn't murdering people, like, you know, he wasn't doing anything like that. Maybe he was closeted or bisexual or whatever you want to call it, but like he wasn't killing people. And then sort of to have that realization of like, yes, he was, but you didn't know. You can't judge a book until you know like the whole story, sort of thing. It's just really interesting to note, like, he felt so much guilt and like he was so aware of what he was doing. But I think a lot of it has to go back, like, and I know this is easy to, you know, pin the connection to, but I think a lot of it has to go back to the way that his father treated him with, like, you know, beating the crap out of him and telling him that he was going to grow up to be a queer, and like, you can't be a queer or you won't get my approval. Like things like that. Like, he, even after his father died, was still trying to get his father's approval. And because he never hit his father back, and then his father died, there was no way to sort of get that like final word in, that last, there was no closure for him. So I think a lot of that anger had built up so much that he ended up taking it out on these poor people that definitely like didn't really deserve it at all. You know, these young boys that he murdered. He admitted to like 33 people that he'd killed. We don't know if there are more or there are less. We don't know if he killed people before that he won't admit to or he doesn't remember because he blacked out. We don't know if he killed people that he wasn't admitting to because he didn't want the number to be too large, or his guilt ran out, or, but who knows? But that's pretty much all the information that I have on him. So that's pretty much it for the episode. Please remember to follow the podcast on anything that you listen to music to, whether it's like Spotify, iTunes, Google Podcasts, stuff like that. We're pretty much on everything possible. I upload it personally to YouTube, so if you want to subscribe to the YouTube page, and you can look at some of the videos there. I basically upload it with the Whispers from Below logo, so you can just listen to it. Like, if you have like YouTube Premium or whatever the like fancy version of it is, where you can listen to music and stuff through YouTube, you can listen to the podcast there if you don't have anything else to listen to it on. You can follow the podcast. It has an Instagram. It's Whispers from Below. No spaces, no underscores, no capitals, no nothing. I post pictures there. I would say I stopped posting there for a while, but I say I post pretty regularly now. And I'm going to get back to posting a lot more regularly. I recently posted a picture of a really cool pop socket prototype that I made for my new phone. So go check that out, because I think that the pop socket turned out really, really, really cool. If you guys are liking some of the merch and stuff that I'm posting, and I start to get enough people that are requesting, what I might start to do is make a website or do it through the Instagram page, where if you DM me saying I want this size and this type and whatever, I can start to get like bulk orders ready of some of the merch and send it out to you people. I have a t-shirt and a sweater that I still have to take pictures in, but as I said last week, I feel really gross right now. It's really hot here in New York and I'm sweating all the time. And my hair is like a weird color, and I have no place to like take pictures in the apartment. That's really nice. So until I can get outside and do some stuff like that, those pictures probably won't be going up for a little bit, but just know that they're there and they're really cute. Since I've been like talking about how I'm going to post pictures of them for like 8 weeks and then haven't, you know, I apologize for that, but I'm very excited about them. It's just, I haven't had a chance to really do anything with that. I think that's pretty much it. This goes up 8 a.m. every Monday. If I'm feeling up to it, I will upload an episode on a Thursday. I don't really think I'm going to be doing that in the near future. If that changes, I'll definitely let you guys know. But remember, Pogo the Clown is really scary. Gacy's kind of a nice guy despite being a murderer. And wash your hands, be safe, and wear a fucking mask.